The opening scene of the movie shows a tracking shot of a field covered in green on a morning lit by the sun. Elizabeth Lizzie Bennet walks across the pitch as a book is being finished. As she approaches the house, she hears her mother inform her father that a wealthy Londoner by the name of Mr Bingley has rented a sizable estate called Netherfield close by. Mrs Bennet urges Mr Bennet to get in touch with Mr Bingley because she thinks he would make an excellent marriage for either of her daughters. Finally acknowledging that he had already met Mr Bingley, Mr Bennet admits that he likes to blame his wife's extreme excitement for his chilly, detached demeanour. The Bennet daughters, who had been attentively listening through the keyhole, all squeal in delight when he reveals that they can all anticipate seeing Mr Bingley at a forthcoming public ball. The younger Lydia and Kitty jump up and down and then start pleading with Jane to let them borrow her most attractive pair of shoes as Lizzie herself and the oldest sister Jane smile contently. Just returning to her piano, Mary continues to play. When Mr Bennet notices the 5 girls were all listening as he exits his study, he simply walks past them while muttering, "Good heavens! People!" Lizzie informs Jane that she has no plans to get married in the future as they watch the dance from the sidelines. Jane scoffs and quirks, "One day, Lizzie, a man will catch your eye and you will then have to hold your tongue." The atmosphere in the room abruptly changes as Mr Bingley, his arrogant sister Caroline, and his faraway, quiet, and incredibly wealthy friend Mr Darcy enter the hallway. Mrs Bennet wastes little time in introducing her girls to the newcomers in her artless and self-conscious manner. She also introduces Charlotte Lucas, a close friend of Lizzie's. Mr Bingley starts up a discussion with Jane and Elizabeth as Mr Darcy and Miss Bingley look on with arrogance. He is quite kind and cheerful, and he and Jane get along well right away. To Mrs Bennet's utter delight, they dance twice together. On the other hand, Mr Darcy does not dance at all. Except for Charles and Caroline Bingley, he scarcely ever speaks to anyone else. He makes a derogatory comment about Lizzie, which Lizzie overhears, giving her the impression that he is rude. Later, she seizes the chance to verbally spar with him in a not very friendly manner. She leaves the dance with the same unfavorable opinion of him that Jane does of Bingley. When the militia are rumored to be staying in their town for the winter, Kitty and Lydia come up to their mother in a daze during the dance and inform her of the news. Numerous chances to meet men are presented by this. Jane receives a letter from Caroline Bingley the following morning inviting her to supper at Netherfield even though Charles won't be there. Jane travels there but contracts a severe cold en route and must stay for an additional few days till she feels better. Mrs Bennet had made Jane ride to Netherfield in a driving rainstorm. It seemed that she had planned the cold in advance so that Jane would have to stay at the house while Mr Bingley was there. Eliza travels many kilometers on muddy roads to Netherfield to see Jane out of concern for her sister. Caroline and Darcy looked surprised when she entered the formal parlour with her hair down and untamed, dirty shoes, and a muddy skirt. Darcy brusquely informs Lizzie that Jane is upstairs taking a nap in response to her apology and concern for her sister. Eliza smiles and heads upstairs to see Jane after being a little taken aback by the speedy response. Immediately after she leaves the room, Caroline Bingley remarked on how messy she is, saying she was almost positively medieval. Jane is being cared for by Mr Bingley while she is unwell. Lizzie stays for a few days. Elizabeth is certain that Mr Bingley is in love with Jane based on his care for her sister and his stumbling speech around her. Caroline shows her ostentatious and aristocratic attitudes at a meeting in the sitting room. She says sassy things about the Bennet families and even Elizabeth's unpolished behavior. She also exhibits Lizzie's verbal sparring prowess, and the two of them are quick to criticize Darcy. Darcy hears her poison in the background but doesn't say anything. He appears to be genuinely offended by them both. Lizzie and Jane are being picked up by Mrs Bennet and her other 3 daughters in Netherfield. In response to Mrs Bennet's request for a dance, Mr Bingley promises to host one shortly. Elizabeth is surprised when Darcy takes her hand to help her into the carriage. After that, the Bennets receive a visit from their dreaded clergyman relative William Collins. He is quite egotistical, patronizing, pretentious, shallow. Influence and wealth appeal to him, and he flatters people in an egregiously stupid way. The atmosphere at dinner is tight, his relatives are unimpressed. Particularly with Lizzie, he engages in some verbal combat. His visit was intended to find a wife among the sisters, so after dinner, he talks to Mrs Bennet about being married to Jane. Lizzie is available, according to Mrs Bennet, but Jane appears to be taken. She is thrilled at the prospect of one of her children being married to the man who will be taking over the estate anyhow. The following morning, the girls go outside to see a parade of the militia. Kitty and Lydia are especially keen on making out with them. They later encounter one of them, a charming lieutenant named Wickham. To get ribbons for the impending dance, they all visit a local shop. They run into Bingley and Darcy on their way home. Wickham and Darcy exchange chilly looks before Darcy abruptly departs. There is some sort of strong hostility between the two. Wickham explains that Darcy had duped him out of Darcy's father's kind gift to him. After Wickham inquires about this after Darcy and Bingley leave, and Elizabeth is perplexed by the men's interactions with one another. Given Darcy's character, Elizabeth is amazed by the account but not wholly shocked. She now has even lower expectations for Darcy. The entire family attends Bingley's dance. Wickham is unable to be found despite Lizzie's keen interest in doing so. This is probably because of their feud with Darcy. Lizzie is extremely disgusted when Collins invites her to dance. He adores her, yet she seldom gives him a glance or engages in conversation. When Darcy finally shows up, he invites Lizzie to dance. She agrees and quickly departs for a peaceful area with Charlotte. They laugh in shock, and Eliza, grinning, says, "This is most inconvenient," as she had prepared herself to despise him forever. She and him have a verbal duel throughout the dance, during which she brings up Mr Wickham. Despite the fact that Darcy feels quite uneasy, it is obvious that their tense social interactions may be a result of their infatuation. Lizzie gets warned by Charlotte to support Mr Bingley by increasing Jane's attraction and attention for him. Elizabeth argues in Jane's defense that she is reticent and timid but does not require much attention. "We are all fools in love," as said by Charlotte. Caroline makes several harsh comments to Darcy about the Bennets and their relative Mr Collins' numerous social faux pas and generally shabby behavior. Just as the Bennet family is about to leave, Bingley grins at Jane, and Caroline recognizes that the expression on her brother's face can only mean one thing: love. If she wants to do anything about it, she had to act right once. She opposes her brother wedding a Bennet. The following morning, Mr Collins makes the most ostentatious and egotistical proposal to Lizzie. Lizzie declines the offer since she dislikes him completely. She turned down the pretentious ass, much to the amusement of her sisters who were as usual listening at the door. But Mrs Bennet is appalled that there was ever a chance to get married, especially with the man who would have been the estate's heir. She insists Lizzie make a decision. Mr Bennet, though, supports Lizzie. The Bingleys and Darcy are leaving Netherfield permanently, as per letter from Caroline. According to the letter, Darcy needs to return to his sister Georgiana's side. Lizzie discovers that Caroline took Bingley away in order to introduce him to Darcy's younger sister. Jane accepts the possibility that Bingley may not have ever truly loved her. Lizzie protests and insists she should not give up since she is positive Bingley loves her. With the assurance that Bingley will send for her before the week is out, Lizzie advises Jane to travel to London and stay with her aunt and uncle. The following morning, Jane leaves the family and rides off to London in search of love. Lizzie is visited by Charlotte Lucas, who informs her that she has become engaged to Mr Collins. Lizzie is horrified that she would marry a man who is so arrogant. Charlotte responds that she is in severe need of a financially stable marriage since, at the age of 27, she risks becoming a destitute old woman. A few weeks later, Charlotte extends an invitation to Lizzie to come and see her in her new residence with Mr Collins. Lizzie can tell that Charlotte is truly joyful. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is also Darcy's aunt, is Mr Collins' neighbour and patron. He invites Lizzie and Charlotte to meet her. She receives a lot of adoring and obedient attention from Mr Collins. There are also Mr Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam, his cousin. Lady de Bourgh is an extremely haughty, conceited, insolent, and domineering individual. She questions Lizzie about her family throughout supper. Lizzie is directed by Lady de Bourgh to play the piano after a meal. Despite Lizzie's protests that she is a terrible musician, Lady de Bourgh will not be dissuaded. Darcy approaches Lizzie as she struggles through a piano piece, and the two of them begin to argue verbally. Lizzie is approached by Fitzwilliam, who inquires about her thoughts on the initial meeting she had with Darcy. He exhibits what Lizzie describes as antisocial behavior by refusing to interact or dance with anyone. Darcy argues that he is not good at starting conversations with individuals he hasn't met before. The insults keep coming. Lizzie's criticisms seem to have hurt Darcy. The following day, Mr Darcy appears to want to speak to Lizzie when he arrives at the home, but he quickly becomes completely tongue-tied and unable to speak. He appears to be confused and agitated as he exits. Colonel Fitzwilliam and Lizzie converse quietly while listening to Mr Collins' dull sermon in church. Fitzwilliam confesses that Darcy, and not Caroline, had broken up Mr Bingley and Jane. Darcy later encounters Lizzie in a shelter from a torrential downpour and declares his love for her, adding that this is against his better judgment and in spite of her lower social status. The argument turns really sour. Lizzie criticizes Darcy for being arrogant and, more significantly, interfering with Jane and Bingley. Darcy adds that he took this action because he thought Jane wasn't really into the relationship. Liz argues that Jane is just extremely shy. My sister rarely communicates her true emotions to me. Darcy also makes incredibly derogatory remarks about the surviving Bennet family members. Lizzie also mentions Mr Wickham's allegation that Darcy defrauded him of his wealth. Due to her distress about the encounter, Lizzie spends the rest of the day dwelling on it at home. Darcy drops off a letter he has written and comes by just before dark. Nobody hears Lizzie speak. Darcy addresses his relationship with Wickham in the letter. It is true that Wickham received a sizable annual allowance from Darcy's father. Wickham asked and was given the entire principal, lost it all on gambling, and then returned for more. Darcy objected. Later, Wickham came back and attempted to flee with Georgiana, the sister of Darcy, to receive Georgiana's inheritance of £30,000. He vanished after being informed that he would not receive it. In his letter, Darcy also writes that Georgiana, who was just 15 at the time, was devastated by this and fell into a severe state of depression. Darcy clarified that he had kept Jane away from Bingley because he genuinely thought that doing so would benefit his buddy. Lizzie goes back home. Jane, who'd been unable to locate Mr Bingley in London, has also returned home. She attempts to convince Lizzie that she has grown tired of her attraction to Bingley, but fails miserably. Lizzie is questioned about any updates following the meeting with Charlotte. Lizzie lies when she says no. She expressly refutes any remark Darcy made towards Bingley. Also, Colonel Forster has extended a vacation invitation to Lydia to visit Brighton, a South Coast resort. Because Lydia is immature and impetuous, Lizzie believes it is a poor idea because she might get into problems. After pleading with her father to stop her, Lizzie becomes enraged when he doesn't. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, the aunt and uncle of the Bennet sisters, are in town and will be spending time in the nearby Peak District. Lizzie agrees to go with them when they extend the invitation. A visit at Pemberley, Darcy's opulent home that is close by and open to visitors, is recommended by Lizzie's aunt and uncle as they continue their journey. Lizzie is averse to Darcy and does not want to be anywhere near him, but after learning that he is absent, she agrees to go. Lizzie is absolutely entranced by the luxury and splendor of the house and gardens, especially a sculpture exhibit. The maid informs the three guests of Mr. Darcy's kindness, compassion, and generosity. Lizzie starts to wonder if her initial opinion of him was inaccurate. Lizzie sneaks a glance at a young woman playing the piano in a nearby room. It turns out to be Georgiana, Darcy's younger sister. As soon as Darcy walks in, the young woman and him exchange warm greetings and embraces. Lizzie leaves and exits immediately. Darcy pursues her and tries ineffectively to make amends. He says that he arrived home from his trip early. He offers to drive Lizzie back to the inn where she is staying, but she says she will walk instead. Lizzie is informed by Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner that Darcy spoke to them, gave a good impression of himself, and extended an invitation for everyone to return to Pemberley the following day so that Lizzie might meet Georgiana and Mr. Gardiner can go fishing. That is what they do. Georgiana says to Lizzie when they first meet, "My brother has told me so much about you. We already feel friendly, in my opinion." After that, Darcy charms Lizzie into performing piano duets with the far more gifted Georgiana. This is the first time that Lizzie and Darcy engage in a way that is entirely friendly and cordial. Darcy is now figuring out how to communicate in a pleasant manner. That evening, Lizzie, Darcy, and the Gardiners all eat dinner at the inn. Lizzie receives a letter informing her that Lydia has fled with Mr. Wickham, devastating news. Darcy holds himself responsible for this by not calling Wickham's treachery out sooner. The others hastily return to the Bennet's house as he then departs. In an effort to track down Lydia and Wickham and compel their union, Mr. Bennet has travelled to London. The family is completely destroyed since an incident like this would have completely destroyed the family and their society. None of them will be able to find successful marriages, and upon Mr. Bennet's passing, they will forfeit the estate. Mr. Gardiner is still looking while Mr. Bennet has returned. Then a letter says that Mr. Gardiner has located them and that they are willing to get married as long as Wickham is given a settlement of £100 per year. They are persuaded that even if Mr. Bennet will pay it, Mr. Gardiner is covering the majority of the cost because the true demand must have been in the thousands. After that, the newlyweds visit before departing for the north of England, where Wickham will be deployed. The information that Lydia was supposed to keep a secret, that Darcy was present at the wedding and was actually the one who discovered her and Wickham, is revealed by Lydia during lunch. Lizzie understands that Darcy had been honourable and kind to the Bennet family and that he must have been the one to settle Wickham's debt. Later, the Bennet family finds out that Mr. Bingley is coming back to town. Jane tries to convince Lizzie that she no longer cares about him, but she comes out as less than convincing. Additionally, Mrs. Bennet acts unconcerned. A little while later, Mr. Bingley and Darcy show up at the residence. There is a funny moment where the family scrambles to tidy the disorganized living room and finishes just in time. Even while Mrs. Bennet appears uninterested, it is obvious that she is delighted at the prospect of Bingley popping the question to Jane. But everyone involved finds the encounter to be a little awkward. The two then go out a short distance from the home, where Darcy assists Bingley in practicing his marriage proposal to Jane. Back at the home, Lizzie starts to understand that Darcy brought Bingley back to town in an effort to make up for the hurt created by severing their relationship. She comes to understand that her initial opinion of Darcy was inaccurate. When Bingley comes back, he asks Jane to marry him, and she accepts, with the rest of the family watching carefully from the door. That evening, the Bennet family is overjoyed, until someone knocks on the door. Lady de Bourgh is there. She insults Lizzie a few times before imperiously asking to speak to Lizzie alone. She informs Lizzie that she has heard a rumor suggesting that Lizzie and her nephew Darcy would get married. She finds it revolting that he would marry into such a low-class family, ruining the family name. She demands that Lizzie make a vow that she would never wed Darcy and that the rumor is untrue. In an almost unheard-of breach of decorum towards the nobility, Lizzie refuses to do so and orders Lady de Bourgh to leave. Lizzie learns about the rumor for the first time and concludes that Darcy must have started it since it indicates his true interest in her. She can't sleep since she is so distraught by her interaction with Lady de Bourgh. She finally gets up just before dawn and goes for a walk outside. While out on a walk, she runs across Darcy. He had also having trouble falling asleep. He came to the conclusion that there was a chance Lizzie may propose to him when Lady de Bourgh informed him of Lizzie's failure to refute the rumor. He expresses his hope that their previous interactions have caused her to change her opinion of him. "You are too generous to trifle with me," he apologizes for his previous actions before putting her in the position of getting engaged. She agrees as the sun begins to rise in their direction. Darcy approaches Lizzie later that morning and proposes marriage in Mr. Bennet's study. Later, after he has left, Lizzie enters to speak with her father. "I assumed you detested the subject." "No, Papa, I was mistaken. About him, I was completely mistaken." He nods in agreement and says, "I could not have parted with you, my dear Lizzie, to anyone less worthy." When she departs, Mr. Bennet yells, "If any young men appear for Mary or Kitty, for heaven's sake, send them in. I'm quite at my leisure," having already gotten 3 of his 5 daughters engaged or married within just a short period of time. Well, that's all for today's video. We hope you enjoyed it, and please support us by subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to get notification for new videos every we post.